welcome to another episode of the Chicana Therapist Podcast. I'm Dr. Xochilt Alamillo, and today I want to acknowledge that it is Pride Month. Happy Pride Month to all who celebrate. I have a lot of queer loved ones in my life that I care about deeply, and I come to you in this episode not as someone who is part of the community. I am a straight lady, but I strive to be an ally every day. And so I'm hoping that this episode serves as just more information and acknowledgement of some of the issues that come up, especially in the Latinx community around queerness. Content warning, I will be talking about homophobia, family rejection, and mental health struggles that impact the queer community. And so if this is something that you think is too much for you, then please do what you need to do. But I think that it's important that we talk about difficult things, because I think there's a lot of things that we don't really acknowledge as a community, or we acknowledge it, but we kind of dismiss it or minimize it. And I need people to know how impactful our behavior can be on individuals that are part of the queer community. So today I want to talk about what it might be like to hold multiple identities at once. Last episode, I talked about being bicultural, and I know that this is kind of in that same avenue because you have multiple identities and you're a part of both. However, you can feel rejected. But I want to go into more about that intersectionality, and I also want to talk about the mental health impact of navigating queerness in a traditional Latinx family and community. My sincere desire is that individuals from the queer community hopefully feel seen and heard, but I invite the broader community to listen with an open heart and be real about some of these things that we'll be talking about today, whether or not you have perpetuated some of these actions or maybe you've witnessed them and didn't say anything. So let's get into it. So I want to briefly address intersectionality. Intersectionality is actually a theory that was developed by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And I don't want to get too much into the academic side of it, and I'm just going to use it as inspiration. I'm going to use it to help explain a little bit about what I mean when talking about having multiple identities. Because the thing is that we don't experience our identities one at a time. We live them simultaneously. So someone who identifies as Latinx or Latinx and identifies as queer, they don't get to only live in one identity. And we can talk about whether or not people are out and things like that, but for the most part, in themselves, they are all of these identities at the same time. So for queer Latinx individuals, this means that they're navigating things that other people might experience, right? They're navigating race, they're navigating ethnicity, they're navigating gender. However, now they're also navigating sexual identity, gender identity, and each of that has its own set of pressures, its own possibility for discrimination, right? Because being a woman can be difficult. Sure, there's a lot of challenges, but being a lesbian woman, for example, or a trans woman is a whole other level. So I want to talk about how sometimes in the community we can be like, well, you're gay, but you're a woman and I'm a woman, so I get it. No, we don't really get it. We can't really get it. Having certain identities together can amplify things, can amplify discrimination, can amplify all the isms. And so when I talk about feeling othered, sometimes people might make us feel othered, right? Like if we're in an all-white space, we might feel othered because people are making comments about our identity when the other white people aren't getting comments on theirs. However, you add to that other identities like queerness, and it makes it that much more complicated. In fact, being queer, especially in Latinx spaces, can feel dangerous, can feel unsafe, or they can just feel invisible. So carrying on this conversation from the last episode about being bicultural and not feeling like you belong in either space, this can be, again, amplified and can be very exhausting because queer Latinx folks might not feel like they belong in any of the spaces they're in. I mean, they're queer and they can be in queer spaces, but maybe they're the only brown queer person or the only person of color that's queer. And then they'll be in Latinx spaces and they might feel like they don't belong because they're brown, they're Latinx, but they're queer and maybe they're not a whole lot of other people like them. So I want to highlight how this can be an added stress on individuals with queer identities. Now, of course, I don't want to just talk about how exhausting it is. I want to acknowledge that queer people exist and have always existed. And yes, there is beauty and resilience in the community and the identities that they hold. And they have contributed tremendously to society, to their own communities, but other communities as well. And so I want to name that because I want to make it clear that I am not trying to say that being queer is like a diagnosis or anything of the sort. I want to just create more awareness as a community to how the things we do participate in or the things we don't do can impact our loved ones. And I don't think that most of us out there want to hurt our loved ones. And so that is why I mention a lot of the things that can be difficult, but also want to acknowledge that there are beautiful things about queer identities and queer communities. Another theory I want to briefly mention is a minority stress theory. When we think about being a part of multiple communities and never really feeling like we belong in all of them, and you constantly find yourself in groups that are stigmatized, that are discriminated against, that can be really stressful on a person, obviously. But I'm not talking about everyday stress, like go to work stress or having a lot of things to do stress. This is a constant state of stress that people can experience. And it's the accumulated weight of existing in a world that marginalizes you from multiple angles. Because if you think about it, queer Latinx people specifically experience rejection or stress from broader society for both being brown and being queer. They experience it from within the Latinx community because let's be real, our community is fucking homophobic. It's come a long way, sure, but it's still incredibly homophobic. Not that non-Latinx ones aren't, but I'm talking to us. And then on top of that, they might experience rejection from their own family for different reasons. So some specific examples of the added stress that I've noticed in working with individuals and reading literature on being from these identities and listening carefully to loved ones that have shared with me, there is a cost to concealing who you are, sometimes for years, sometimes for your entire life, concealing a part of you. I know that now sometimes we celebrate when people come out to their families, etc. But if you really think about it, how long do these folks have to hide who they are? The fact that they even have to come out, it says a lot. And so that experience of having to hide parts of who you are constantly from people who are supposed to be loving you unconditionally can be really stressful. And then there are some people who maybe are out in the community and friends, but not with family or vice versa. And having to navigate that, like, how do I show up based on who's in the room? What things can I say and share about myself based on who's in the room? That can be really exhausting as well. And it's a cause of stress. So that constant vigilance can be really impactful to well-being. And the reality is that there's also a lot of internalized stigma. So a lot of beliefs about themselves because they hear broader society or Latinx community basically talking shit about your identity. And at some point, some of these individuals feel that way about themselves. They start to believe those things about themselves. So there's a lot of internalized stigma too that individuals might experience who hold queer identities in the Latinx community. And I know I've worked with youth who have this idea, might be real, might just be a fear, this anticipated rejection, this idea of what's going to happen when people find out that I'm queer. Whether that's your parents, your siblings, the extended family, people in your country of origin, like all this constant, like, what's going to happen? What are they going to say? What are they going to do? What are they going to talk about? How are they going to talk about me? Are they going to see me different? That anticipated rejection can really do a number on people's mental health. And so all of these things, whether they experience one, two, all of them, which often happens, can really lead to, like I said, these mental health struggles, anywhere from depression to anxiety to trauma to suicidality. Because in case you didn't know, queer individuals are at much higher risk to attempt suicide than, for example, straight folks or non-people of color. So when you compare queer individuals to straight Latinx folks and you compare them to white queer peers, they have a higher risk of suffering from mental health disorders and attempting suicide. It's a very serious problem. In fact, the rate for Latinx youth attempting suicide, especially young girls, is very high, but it's almost double if they're also queer. So those are all some of the things that queer individuals might be navigating that the rest of us don't necessarily have to navigate. And so that's like that extra stress, that extra pressure on your nervous system on a daily basis. Now, if we talk about being queer in a traditional Latinx context, what I mean by traditional might be like a lot of Latinx families are shaped by Catholicism, which I don't care what the Pope says is still super homophobic and anti-queer. We're looking at traditional gender roles, right? Well, you all know we've talked about Marianismo and Machismo on the podcast before, but this idea of men are masculine, women are feminine, and they have certain roles. And then you add to that collectivist values, this idea of the good of the family comes before the good of any individual. And family unit is everything. When you think about those things, and I want to be clear, none of these things are inherently bad, but it does make for a very specific environment for queer individuals. So I guess I'm never going to get tired about mentioning my dissertation study, but one of the things I found, and if you need a reminder, I interviewed Latinas who had attempted suicide as teenagers about their relationship to being bicultural, their relationship with their parents, and what kind of conflict they had with their parents. And while many of the participants expressed having, fights, discussions, arguments with their parents, some of them expressed having what I call like internal conflict with their parents. So an example of that is that I had a few participants who identified as queer, whose a lot of their internal struggle was that their parents would talk shit about queer people. They'd say very homophobic things. And inside, of course, this youth isn't out and they're thinking, oh my goodness, that is what my mom thinks of me, or that is what my dad thinks of me, or that is what tia, abuela, whatever thinks of me. And then you have this conflict of like, my mom is straight up telling me that, I don't know, insert homophobic comment here. They're hearing family members make casual homophobic comments, whether that's about actual people or using being gay as an insult to other people. And the message is clearly that it's not safe to have this identity to these youth or to adults too. It's not safe. If someone is calling people slurs, homophobic slurs, and the person hasn't come out, what do you think is going through their head when they hear someone express themselves about someone that way? And so sometimes, unfortunately, there are families who they're accepting, but when they're behind closed doors, they might make comments or might say things because they assume that people in their home are not queer. And there's no way for you to really know that. And that has happened a lot in my dissertation. Like I said, it came out as very motivating factors towards having mental health challenges for some of these Latinas. So they are feeling rejected before people even know that there's anything to reject. And that is really harsh on a person's mental health. And so what do they learn? They learn that they have to hide. They learn that they have to perform in certain ways. And they learn that they have to hide parts of themselves long before they even think about coming out. And speaking of coming out in a Latinx family can be different than maybe what you hear, or see on videos on social media, because as a collectivist community, we don't have to worry about just telling mom and dad or siblings. You have to worry about telling your tías, your abuelitos, your abuelitas, family friend, whatever, because they're such a big part of your life. So you have to worry about how they think of you, how they're going to accept you, the whole family system. And I have heard people say that it's not just that they feel like, oh, I'm going to be rejected, though that's enough and huge on its own. But it's also about, I don't want to be anything that brings shame to the family. Even if they know that they have nothing to be ashamed of, they don't want to disrupt the family system like that. So sometimes that can also be an issue for people. So coming out in a Latinx family can feel like the stakes are really high because we're taught that family is everything. We're taught that family is first, family is most important. And if we are rejected, if a queer person is rejected by a family, then their perception is that they've lost everything because they were taught that family is everything, right? And so this is where we see why a lot of queer youth are at such higher risk of mental health challenges, at so much more higher risk, because on top of everything, we're told family's everything, and then they get rejected by that family. And one of the things that I've heard a lot, both on social media as well as just talking to clients and other people in my life, is that sometimes the way that Latinx families deal quote unquote with queerness is that they don't say anything. So they don't outright reject people, but they're just silent. And it comes to a point where the queer family member maybe is tolerated, but they're not fully accepted, never really acknowledged. Maybe their partner is not named, or they call them la amiga de fulana, right? Instead of saying her partner, they say la amiga, la amiguita, el amigo, el amiguito. That is also really hurtful because not saying anything is saying a lot. So this ambiguous acceptance can feel like, yes, you're present, but you're not fully seen. You're loved, but not completely. It's almost like, well, we have to love you because you're our family member, but we're going to pretend that you're not queer. And so I hear a lot of people say like, I had a tia. We all kind of knew, but nobody really talked about it. I mean, think about how harmful that can be for someone to not fully be accepted and loved and acknowledged. That is something really heavy to carry, and it can look like peace, but peace for whom? Peace maybe for the family, but not peace for that individual or their partner. And some people might be happy with this arrangement. I'm just presenting some ways that we can be harmful to our queer loved ones, and some might be okay with that. They might not feel like they have a choice, but I would say that would be really shitty to have to live with. I have also seen family dynamics where the most common issue is that maybe dad does not accept it, but mom does. So everything happens when dad's not around. Like the partner can come over, you can talk about it, but the minute dad walks in, that goes back into hiding. And everyone kind of tiptoes around dad's discomfort. And that can also be really hurtful for a lot of reasons. But it's something that I see a lot in Latinx families that's tolerated by multiple people. It's tolerated by that mom. It's tolerated by other people in the family. And that can be very heavy for a person too. I also want to be clear that these things that I'm talking about are in addition to all the other challenges that queer individuals have to live with just in a society. The lack of representation, the discrimination in job places, the homophobia that they can run into on social media, in person, etc. I'm only talking about family units in the Latinx community for this, but this is in addition to everything else that maybe your white queers might struggle with. So what would it look like to be a part of an affirming family? What might it look like if you want to be warm and safe for all of your queer loved ones. I want to acknowledge for those of you who are in this position that it can be hard. And it can be hard for many reasons. One of them is that there might be deeply held religious beliefs. There might be some cultural values that we hold dear, like this idea of not causing conflict in the family, of not making other people uncomfortable. Or it could be hard because of your own fears of anything, right? I want to acknowledge that it can be really hard, and the well-being of your loved ones is more important than how hard it is for you. Family acceptance can be one of the most important protective factors, especially when we're talking about youth. It can be one of the most protective factors for their mental health. And so while I want to acknowledge that it can be difficult, it can be hard for so many reasons, but I can never tell my abuela anything, blah, blah, blah. Yes, and it's your responsibility to push through that discomfort because someone else's well-being is on the line. Sometimes their life, right? Because sometimes feeling accepted is the difference between wanting to be here and not wanting to be here. And I'm not here to argue with anyone about theology. I'm not here to try to convince you that it's actually not against religious beliefs in the Bible. That's not what I'm here to argue with you. And I'm not here to encourage you to understand everything. I don't want you to, go looking to find some sort of weird permission for you to accept and want to do better for your loved ones. What I am here to tell you is that none of those things really matter to me when it comes to protecting the well-being of a queer individual. And it doesn't have to be grand gestures. You don't have to get someone a cake when they come out, although that might be nice. People enjoy cake. But it does mean that you are using people's name, the name that they say is their name, using the pronouns that they choose and tell you to use. It means acknowledging their partner the same way as you would acknowledge the partner of straight people. It means never asking them to keep part of their identities hidden or to behave in certain ways in front of people. And one that is simple and powerful and maybe really hard still is shut down homophobic comments that are made in your presence. Any homophobic comments from anyone in a family space. And most importantly, telling your person, your loved one, your queer loved one, I love you, you belong here, you will always be my child, nephew, niece, whatever. I love you and you belong fully, unapologetically. And so be willing to manage your own discomfort and not asking your queer loved ones to manage it for you. And be willing to repair any ruptures that have happened. Be willing to say, I fucked up and I'm sorry and I will do my best to make it right. So if you have a loved one who identifies as queer, whether that's gay, trans, whatever the case may be, make sure that they know that the love that you have for them is unconditional and that they're accepted fully. And how you can do that is by, yes, having these conversations, but also by the actions. What are you saying, but also what are you not saying? So yeah, for the month of June, you better be spoiling your queer loved ones however you can. Make sure that they feel seen and heard and loved, and that they have community and they feel like they belong. And just know that our community is big enough to hold us all with all of our identities as our full selves. We don't have to pick and choose, or we shouldn't have to pick and choose how to show up, but we can choose to make it safe, at least around us. So with that, I leave you again. Happy Pride. And if you are interested in our Oaxaca retreat in September of this year, please remember to go to my website, thechicanatherapist.com, click on the retreats tab, and you can get more information there. Or you can send me a message if you have any questions. I am happy to answer them. Other than that, you can follow me on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook, and on YouTube. So thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next time. Thank you for listening. This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing shared in this podcast constitutes therapy, clinical advice, or a therapeutic relationship. Listening to this podcast does not establish a provider-client relationship, and if you're experiencing a mental health crisis or in need of clinical support, please contact a licensed mental health professional or call or text 988 Crisis Hotline.